The Dragon's Return, Chapter 17, A Servant of Two Masters, Part 2. It took Arthur what felt like hours to get out of the now blocked ravine and circle back to where Merlin should have been. By the time he made it there, though, she and the mercenaries were gone. The only sign she had been there was a few more shattered pieces of plate mail. Arthur picked them up, tears of grief and rage building in his eyes. He made it back out of the ravine and heard rustling and voices. Familiar voices. It was good he'd had his sword drawn, though, as he had to deflect Leon's blow. "Sire," he said, grinning. "I'm sorry I didn't see you." Arthur shook his head, his throat too tight for speech. The others were here, too. Everyone but Merlin. His heart gave another painful twist as Gawain looked around behind Arthur. His face fell. "Where's Merlin?" he asked. The others looked around and Percival's face fell. "She's not." "No," Arthur snapped. "She's alive. She was alive when I saw her last. There were 20 or more men, and she collapsed the ravine. I couldn't get back to her. By the time I did, they were gone. And so was she." Arthur bit out, tears threatening him. "We have to go after her," Gawain said. Percival caught him by the shoulder and Gawain, as he made to rush off. "We can't go alone. We're 4 men against dozens at least," Percival said, and Arthur nodded. "I will mobilize every soldier I have to find her if I have to," Arthur assured, and Gawain nodded. "You better," Gawain snarled. It took them another hour to find the horses, then race back to Camelot. The moment they arrived, Arthur was barking orders. They had patrols already getting ready to leave by the time the council convened. Gaius's expression dropped as he entered the room to find Arthur standing at the table without Merlin by his side. "Where's Merlin?" he asked. "She's alive. Last I saw her, she was alive. I've got 4 patrols setting out within the hour," Arthur assured him. Gaius nodded. The next few days dragged. Every time a patrol came back, Arthur felt a swoop of hope and a plummet as if off a cliff when they turned out to be empty-handed. It was as if the mercenaries had simply vanished off the face of the earth with Merlin in tow. There had been no demands either, and that worried Arthur. Demands for ransom were nothing new. Morgana had been kidnapped once or twice when they were much younger. Their father had always promised to pay the ransom and rained retribution on her captors when she was safe. Arthur was contemplating taking a leaf out of his father's book for the first time in years. But still, nothing came. Arthur ran a hand over his face, grimacing at the stubble that was building there. Shaving was something he usually did once a week, but that was something Merlin had been helping him with for years. It had taken her a while to learn how to do it properly, but even at the beginning she'd never slipped and cut him, which was impressive. In hindsight, he suspected she'd been using magic to assist her. She hated seeing others hurt, more so when it came from her own hands, though he knew she'd been forced into action more than once. To save him, the man who'd been unable to save her. He stood from his uneaten breakfast and pulled on his tunic for the day, slamming his way out of his room. He heard a sniffling and paused at Merlin's door, easing it open. Rose sat on the floor inside, looking lost. Across her lap was Ilios. Merlin had adjusted the glamour a few weeks back. No one had questioned why she was now followed everywhere by a young hunting hound. It was a smart disguise. He'd helped her pick the breed. This one could grow nearly as large as a young horse. When she got that big, there would be a new problem. But he'd hoped to have finished the new laws on magic by then. The dragon lifted her head and whined, standing to make her way up to Arthur. He knelt down and hugged her around the neck, feeling rough scales under the illusion of fur. Ithusa was curled up on the bed, almost seeming to be pouting when he realized it wasn't Merlin who had entered the room. "Are you all right, Rose?" Arthur asked. She nodded, scrubbing at her eyes. "Yeah, I'm sorry, sire. I wasn't sure what to do," Rose admitted. "If Ilios and Ithusa aren't eating, and I didn't want them to be sick when Lady Merlin gets back," she said, her lip trembling. "That's sweet of you, Rose. I'll keep an eye on them. Why don't you see if the kitchen can have a few extra jugs of wine sent up to the council chambers? We're going to need it." he said, and Rose nodded, scrambling to her feet, seemingly just glad to have some sort of direction. Once she was gone, Arthur towed the door closed behind him and stared around the empty room. He spotted one of Merlin's neckerchiefs peeking out of a drawer and carefully pulled it out. He took a shaking breath.
I need you to be all right, Merlin. Please be all right,
he muttered. Aethusa sneezed, and Arthur let out a wet laugh. Turning to the two dragons in the room, he regarded them.
I don't suppose you could find her?
He asked, scrubbing at his eyes to rid them of tears. No one was supposed to see him cry. A strong king did not cry.
Don't know,
Aethusa said, and Arthur blinked. The voice was even more childlike than Archimedes, who he hadn't seen since arriving back without Merlin, yet seemed to hold the knowledge of ages.
Merlin's been teaching you to speak, then?
He said, laughing again. Ilios nodded.
a little.
She seemed to frown around her words.
Not easy,
She pouted.
I expect it will get easier,
He said, running a gentle hand down Ilios' spine.
Want to come to the meeting? The patrol Leon took out should be back today.
Arthur offered, and Ilios nodded. He turned to the bed.
Would you like to come as well?
He asked, feeling a little silly. Instead of answering verbally, Aethusa stretched and hopped off the bed before climbing Arthur's clothes as though he was a tree, delicately sinking claws into the shoulders of his shirt as he curled there, as he would for Merlin, though he grumbled as though unsatisfied.
I'd rather she was here too,
Arthur said, guessing at the meaning of the grumbles. It was comforting to have them here, as though he had a piece of Merlin with him. He'd not slept in nearly a week, and only ate a few bites here and there, but the dragons would know if the unthinkable came to pass, right? She was their dragon lord, after all, the last dragon lord. If she was in need, she could call them, or Kilgara. Unless she was too injured to speak. Or worse. We've scoured the forest, Leon said, looking exhausted.
Scour it again,
Arthur ordered. Sire, Leon said, his tone serious. There was no sign of Merlin or the mercenaries. None but this, Agravain said, stepping forward and laying a piece of bloodied cloth on the map that sat in front of Arthur. It had once been blue, dyed a horrible deep purple by the dark blood that stained it. It had to have been torn from the collar of Merlin's tunic. Arthur felt his world narrow to that piece of fabric as he reached up to it. The blood had long dried. It had been a week since she had been wounded. No telling when this had been torn from her. I'm sorry you've lost such a loyal, and Agravain began, and Arthur held up a hand, cutting off his uncle.
The mercenaries. You say they're gone as well?
Arthur asked, directing his words to Leon, his tone cold and collected. We found no sign, Leon confirmed. Surely sent by that snake, Alaned, Agravain suggested. Arthur shook his head.
6 people, outside of those who rode out, knew our route, if that,
Arthur said, his tone icy.
Then there is only one conclusion we can draw,
Leon said, his expression hardening. We have a traitor in our midst. Arthur's fingers tightened around the scrap of Merlin's tunic. Wherever she was now, whatever had happened to her had happened because someone had sold them out. He would find them and make his father's worst day look like a walk in the park.